The courtroom was silent as Zekathara walked to the witness stand. Her forearms moved slowly, each one bearing scars from battles fought 50 years ago. The Carillion warrior had once been feared across 3 star systems. Now she looked older, tired, and somehow smaller than her 7-foot frame suggested. The judge, a tall Vesperian with silver skin, watched as Zekathara settled into the specially built chair. Around the courtroom sat representatives from dozens of alien species. Some had fought in the war. Others had only heard the stories. All of them wanted to know the truth about what happened during those 7 years of conflict. "State your name and rank for the record," the prosecutor said. He was human, which made several aliens in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. "Zekathara, former senior scout of the 4th Carillion Regiment, Galactic Coalition Forces," she replied. Her voice was rough like gravel grinding together. "You served throughout the Human Coalition War?" "Yes, from the first day to the last." The prosecutor walked closer. "The Coalition had superior technology, correct? Better weapons, shields, faster ships?" "Much better. Our plasma cannons could cut through human ships like paper. Our shields could stop anything they had. We had faster-than-light communication across the entire galaxy. They had primitive radio signals, superior numbers, 10 Coalition soldiers for every human, sometimes more. Yet the war lasted 7 years. Why?" Zekathara's eyes closed for a moment. When she opened them, the courtroom could see something that looked like fear. "Because we did not understand what humans were willing to become." The prosecutor nodded. "Tell us about your first encounter with human forces." Zekathara's mind went back to those early days. She had been young then, eager to prove herself in what everyone said would be a quick war. The humans had attacked 3 Coalition trade routes and destroyed several mining operations. The Coalition response was swift and overwhelming. "We were told it would take 3 months," she said. "Maybe 6 if the humans were stubborn. Our commanders said human technology was 500 years behind ours. Their weapons were crude. Their ships were slow. They had no real military beyond small planetary defense forces." "What was your first mission?" "Reconnaissance on Kepler 442b, a human farming colony. Population 50,000. We were to scout before the main invasion force arrived." She remembered approaching the planet in stealth mode. The Coalition had learned much about human settlements from previous observations. They knew humans liked to build near water, that they grew crops in organized patterns, that they lived in family groups. "What did you find?" "Nothing." The word hung in the air like a weight. The cities were empty, not destroyed, not damaged. Empty. As if 50,000 people had simply walked away and never returned. Zekathara described moving through the abandoned streets with her scouting team. The houses were clean. Food was still in storage areas. Personal belongings remained on tables and in closets. But there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication of where the humans had gone. "We thought maybe they had evacuated to other planets," she continued. "But their ships were still in the spaceport. Their factories were still running on automatic systems. Their power plants were functioning perfectly." The prosecutor waited for her to continue. "Then we found the messages." "What kind of messages?" "Written on walls, on paper carved into trees. They were in our languages. Perfect translations into Carillion, Vesperian, Talnari. Even rare dialects that only a few thousand beings in the galaxy could speak." The courtroom murmured. It was well known that humans had struggled with basic galactic languages during first contact protocols. "What did these messages say?" Zekathara's voice became quieter. "They were stories. Personal stories. About human families who had lived in those houses. About children who had played in those parks. About old humans who had died peacefully in their beds." She described reading message after message. A human female named Sarah who had baked bread every morning for 40 years. A human male called Thomas who had taught children about star patterns. An elderly human named Chen who had grown flowers that bloomed in complex mathematical patterns. "They were not threats or warnings," Zekathara explained. "They were memories. But embedded in each story were details about our invasion plans, our supply routes, our command structure. Information that should have been impossible for humans to know." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Explain." The story about Sarah mentioned that she always baked extra bread on the 3rd day of each week, because that was when the supply ships arrived. But it also mentioned that Coalition supply ships always traveled in groups of 7, that they carried food synthesizers that required rare minerals we could only mine from 2 systems, and that our logistics officers always placed supply depots exactly 47 kilometers from major population centers. The courtroom was completely silent now. The story about Thomas teaching star patterns included detailed information about coalition naval formations, patrol schedules, and the fact that our communication officers were required to check in every 6 hours or automatic distress signals would alert the entire fleet. Zekthara explained how her team had initially dismissed this as coincidence. Surely the humans could not have gathered such detailed intelligence about coalition operations. But as they read more messages, the pattern became clear. Chen's flower story described the mathematical patterns he grew, but those same mathematical patterns were the exact encryption codes used by Coalition Command for Secure Communications. The guy prosecutor walked to a display screen and showed images of the abandoned colony. What was your team's conclusion? That 50,000 humans had not simply evacuated. They had transformed their entire colony into an intelligence-gathering operation and then disappeared like ghosts, leaving behind everything we needed to know that they knew everything about us. Zekthara described how her team had searched for weeks, finding more messages, more stories, more impossible details about coalition operations. Every human who had lived on that planet had apparently been gathering information, analyzing patterns, and preparing for war in ways that seemed impossible. We reported our findings to command, she said. They told us we were being paranoid. How could primitive humans possibly gather such detailed intelligence? How could they coordinate such an operation without advanced communication systems? How could they translate their findings into dozens of alien languages they had supposedly never encountered? What happened next? The main invasion force arrived. 12,000 coalition soldiers with the latest weapons and equipment. The planet was officially conquered in 6 hours. She paused. That was when the real war began. The prosecutor waited. Because conquering an empty planet is not a victory, it is a trap. And those 50,000 humans had not disappeared. They had scattered across the galaxy, carrying with them complete intelligence about coalition military operations, technology, and psychology. Zekthara looked around the courtroom. We thought we were fighting a war against primitive humans with crude weapons. Instead, we were fighting a war against humans who had studied us so completely that they understood our own military better than we did. And they had done it all while appearing to be simple farmers growing crops on a distant planet. The prosecutor nodded. What did you learn about human nature from this experience? Zekthara's forearms moved restlessly. That humans do not fight the war you expect them to fight. They fight the war they choose to fight, and they choose very carefully. The prosecutor brought up a holographic display showing star charts from the second year of the war. Red markers indicated coalition victories. Blue showed human-controlled territory. The pattern looked strange, with blue zones scattered seemingly at random throughout red-dominated space. Tell us about the Battle of Kepler 442b, the prosecutor said. Zekthara's eyes focused on the display. That was where we learned that humans do not fight the way anyone else fights. She described how the coalition had decided to make an example of the planet. After the intelligence disaster at the farming colony, Command wanted a clear, overwhelming victory to boost morale and send a message to human forces throughout the galaxy. We brought everything, Zekthara said. 50,000 troops, orbital bombardment platforms, psychological warfare specialists, even surrender negotiation teams. The planet had 3 major cities and several million human civilians. The plan was simple and effective. The coalition would demonstrate their orbital bombardment capability by destroying empty areas near the cities. This would show the humans that resistance was hopeless. Then they would offer generous surrender terms: relocation to pleasant worlds, full citizenship rights, integration into coalition society. It had worked on 47 other species, Zekthara explained. Show overwhelming force, offer generous terms, achieve peaceful surrender. Everyone benefits, minimal casualties. The human response was not what anyone expected. They sent a single message to our flagship, Zekthara continued. Audio only and perfect coalition standard. A human female speaking very calmly. The message had been short. We know you are afraid of us now. We understand why. We want you to understand us too. That was all? The prosecutor asked. That was all? No surrender, no counter threats, no negotiation. Just that message. Zekthara described how the coalition had proceeded with their demonstration. They selected an uninhabited forest area 50 kilometers from the nearest city and fired a single orbital bombardment blast. The explosion was visible from orbit, a perfect circle of destruction 5 kilometers wide. We waited for their response. Surrender offers, negotiation requests, anything. Instead, we received data packets. What kind of data? Personal files about every coalition soldier in the invasion force. The courtroom stirred. Several aliens looked uncomfortable. Complete psychological profiles, Zekthara explained. Not just basic information like names and ranks, but detailed analysis of personality patterns, family relationships, fears, hopes, childhood experiences, favorite foods, sleeping habits, everything. She described opening her own file. The humans knew she had been born on a colony world where the winters were harsh. They knew she missed the sound of wind through crystal formations. They knew she had lost her clutch sister in a training accident and blamed herself. They knew she preferred to sleep in elevated positions because it made her feel safer. How could they possibly know such things? The prosecutor asked. We did not understand then. But the files included source information, surveillance of coalition social networks, analysis of personal communications, psychological evaluation of behavioral patterns observed during previous battles. Zekthara explained that the humans had been studying coalition forces the same way coalition scientists studied new species. They had analyzed speech patterns to understand emotional states, tracked social interactions to map relationships, and used behavioral psychology to predict individual responses to stress. But more than that, she continued, they had been reaching out. Explain. Some soldiers found personal messages in their files. Not threats or demands, but communications. A human who had studied Carillion crystal music and wanted to share compositions. A human botanist who had questions about Vesperian agricultural techniques. A human child who had drawn pictures of Thalnari star patterns and wanted to know if they were accurate. The prosecutor waited for her to continue. They were not trying to frighten us with how much they knew. They were trying to connect with us as individuals. Zekthara described how this had affected coalition forces. Soldiers who discovered humans had taken interest in their culture, their families, their personal hobbies. Warriors who found that humans had studied their species not to find weaknesses, but to understand their perspectives. It was psychological warfare, she said, but not the kind we expected. What happened next? The equipment failures began. Zekthara explained how coalition systems had started malfunctioning in subtle ways. Communication delays that lasted just long enough to disrupt coordination. Weapon targeting systems that developed minor calibration errors. Life support systems that functioned perfectly, but produced annoying sounds that interfered with sleep. We assumed it was sabotage, but our technical teams could find no evidence of tampering. The equipment was functioning within normal parameters, just not optimally. The prosecutor showed technical readouts on the display. Your investigation concluded what? That humans had somehow gained access to our manufacturing specifications and had analyzed the psychological profiles of the beings who would be using the equipment. They had not damaged our systems. They had optimized them to be irritating to our specific species. Zekthara described how Carillion soldiers found their armor adjusted to create pressure points that triggered anxiety responses. Vesperian troops discovered their weapons had been modified to produce frequencies that caused headaches. Thalnari equipment had been altered to emit scents that reminded them of death. It was not sabotage in any conventional sense, she explained. It was psychological manipulation through technology. They had studied us so thoroughly that they could predict exactly how to make us uncomfortable without actually harming us. What was the strategic purpose? To demonstrate that they could reach us anywhere, anytime in ways we could not predict or prevent. To show that our technological superiority meant nothing if they understood us better than we understood ourselves. Zekthara explained how Coalition Command had responded by increasing security protocols, changing equipment regularly, and implementing new counterintelligence measures. But every change they made seemed to be anticipated. They were always one step ahead, she said. Not because they had better technology, but because they had better understanding of how we think. The prosecutor brought up recordings of coalition military communications from that period. Your reports mention increased psychological stress among coalition forces. Elaborate soldiers began to feel like they were being watched constantly, not by human spies, but by human scientists who were studying them like laboratory specimens. Every action, Every decision, every emotional response was being analyzed and understood. Zechithera described how this had affected morale throughout the Coalition fleet. Warriors who had fought dozens of battles began experiencing doubt and anxiety. Veterans who had never questioned their abilities started making simple mistakes. But the worst part, she continued, was that the humans were right about us. Their psychological profiles were accurate. Their predictions about our behavior were correct. Their understanding of our cultures was deeper than our own. How did this affect the battle outcome? There was no battle. After 6 weeks of equipment malfunctions, psychological pressure, and growing awareness that the humans knew everything about us, Coalition Command decided to withdraw. The prosecutor looked surprised. You retreated from a planet you could have easily conquered? We retreated from a planet full of beings who had demonstrated they could manipulate our thoughts, emotions, and behavior without us even knowing it was happening. We retreated from people who had shown they understood us so completely that fighting them would have been like fighting our own. Reflections. Zechithera looked around the courtroom. That was when we realized we were not fighting a war against humans. We were fighting a war against ourselves, guided by human understanding of our own nature, and they were winning without firing a single shot. The prosecutor activated a new display showing battlefield footage from multiple planets. The images were grainy, taken from Coalition helmet cameras during combat operations. The war entered a new phase in the 3rd year, he said. Tell us about the tactics you encountered. Zechithera watched the footage with visible discomfort. That was when we learned that humans had been studying war itself, not just weapons or strategy, but the nature of conflict. She pointed to one of the videos showing Coalition forces advancing through what appeared to be empty terrain. This was taken on Proxima 7. Our intelligence indicated no human military presence for 50 kilometers in any direction. Standard advanced full security protocols. The footage showed her unit moving carefully through rocky terrain. Suddenly, one of the Coalition soldiers stumbled and fell. Then another. Then the camera went dark. What happened? We had been walking through a graveyard. Zechithera explained how humans had been using a tactic they called the Gilly Doctrine. Human soldiers would bury themselves in shallow graves, covered with local vegetation and breathing through concealed tubes. They would remain motionless for days or weeks, surviving on minimal supplies. How is that possible? Human biology is different from ours. They can slow their heart rate, control their breathing, enter states that are almost like death but not quite. They call it meditation, but it is really a form of voluntary hibernation. She described how Coalition forces had unknowingly walked past dozens of buried humans who were waiting for the perfect moment to strike, not to kill, which would have been expected, but to disable equipment and disappear again. They would emerge just long enough to damage our communication systems or plant tracking devices on our vehicles. Then they would bury themselves again and wait for the next opportunity. The prosecutor showed another video. What about this incident? The footage showed Coalition medics treating their own wounded after a skirmish. Suddenly, several patients began exhibiting symptoms of unknown diseases. Metabolic warfare, Zechithera said quietly. Humans deliberately infected themselves with diseases and parasites, then allowed themselves to be captured. They made themselves sick on purpose. Worse than that, they engineered their own infections to be specifically challenging for Coalition medical systems. Not deadly, but requiring expensive treatments and constant monitoring. Zechithera explained how captured humans would arrive at Coalition medical facilities already suffering from carefully planned illnesses. The diseases were never fatal, but they required significant resources to treat and created chaos in medical logistics. A single infected human prisoner could tie up an entire medical facility for weeks. They needed constant monitoring, specialized equipment, isolation protocols. Meanwhile, Coalition soldiers who actually needed medical attention were forced to wait. This was biological warfare? No, it was resource warfare. They were not trying to kill us with disease. They were trying to overwhelm our support systems by becoming expensive to care for. The prosecutor brought up medical records. Your reports indicate these humans often recovered and attempted to help treat Coalition soldiers. That was the strangest part. Once their planned illnesses had created the desired chaos, many of these humans would begin offering medical assistance. They had extensive knowledge of Coalition biology and could treat wounds more effectively than our own medics, Zechithera described. how captured humans had actually saved. Coalition lives while simultaneously sabotaging Coalition operations. They would cure diseases they had introduced while gathering intelligence about Coalition medical capabilities. They turned our own compassion against us, she explained. We could not refuse medical treatment to prisoners, even when we suspected they had made themselves sick deliberately. And we could not refuse their help when they proved they could save our wounded soldiers. The prosecutor showed footage from a different battle. Tell us about psychological mirrors. Zekthara's expression darkened. That was the worst part of all. She explained how humans had begun studying individual Coalition soldiers so thoroughly that they could predict their actions days in advance. But instead of using this knowledge to set traps, they used it to create psychological pressure. They would leave personal items belonging to dead Coalition soldiers in places where specific living soldiers would find them. Explain. If a Carillion warrior had lost a clutch brother in battle, humans would leave that brother's weapon where the warrior would discover it during routine patrol. If a Vesperian had a favorite piece of music, humans would arrange for that song to be playing on abandoned radio equipment just as the Vesperian passed by. Zekthara described how these encounters were not random. Humans had analyzed Coalition psychological profiles so completely that they could predict when and where specific soldiers would be at certain times, what their emotional state would be, and exactly what type of discovery would have the maximum psychological impact. It was not torture or cruelty, she said. It was like they were holding up mirrors that showed us our own grief, our own fears, our own losses. They made us face our emotions in the middle of combat operations. What was the effect? Coalition soldiers began experiencing what human psychologists call post-traumatic stress disorder, even when they had not been in traumatic situations. They were being forced to relive their worst memories in the middle of military operations. The prosecutor showed communication logs. Your reports mentioned soldiers requesting transfers, refusing missions, even deserting? Yes, but not because they were afraid of being killed. They were afraid of being understood so completely that their own emotions could be used against them. Zekthara explained how humans had turned emotional responses into tactical disadvantages. Coalition soldiers who were experiencing grief would make predictable mistakes. Warriors dealing with anger would take predictable risks. Leaders struggling with doubt would make predictable decisions. They were not reading our minds, she said. They were reading our hearts, and they were better at it than we were. The prosecutor brought up after-action reports from Coalition commanders. Multiple reports mention humans fighting in ways that defied military logic, suicidal attacks that somehow succeeded, impossible defensive positions that held against overwhelming odds, supply missions through hostile territory that should have failed, but didn't. That was when we realized humans use emotions as fuel for military operations. Explain, Zekthara described battles where human soldiers had fought with impossible endurance, sustained by what they called love for their families. Human defensive positions that held for weeks because the soldiers were motivated by grief for their fallen comrades. Human supply convoys that traveled through dangerous territory because the drivers were inspired by hope for a better future. Coalition military doctrine is based on logic, efficiency, and calculated risk assessment, she explained. Human military doctrine is based on emotional commitment that transcends rational analysis. Give us a specific example. The defense of New Shanghai. 40,000 human civilians and 3,000 human soldiers holding a city against 60,000 Coalition troops with air support and orbital bombardment capability. Zekthara described how the Coalition had expected quick surrender when they demonstrated their overwhelming superiority. Instead, human defenders had fought for 4 months using tactics that made no logical sense. They would sacrifice entire units to save single wounded soldiers. They would risk strategic positions to evacuate civilian children. They would waste ammunition on symbolic gestures that had no military value. Yet they held the city. They held the city because every illogical decision was motivated by emotional commitment that made their soldiers fight harder than physics should have allowed. A human defending his daughter's school will not retreat when a rational soldier would. A human fighting for her dead husband's memory will not surrender when a logical soldier should. Zekthara looked at the prosecutor. We were fighting an army that used love as a weapon, grief as armor, and hope as ammunition. Our rational approach to warfare could not compete with their emotional approach to survival. The courtroom lights dimmed as the prosecutor brought up classified recordings from the final phase of the war. Several aliens in the gallery looked away from the display, as if they could not bear to see what was coming. "Tell us about the siege of New Geneva," the prosecutor said quietly. Zekathara's forearms began to shake. Even 50 years later, the memory clearly caused her distress. "That was when we learned the darkest truth about human nature, that they are willing to become monsters if that is what victory requires." She described how coalition forces had finally broken through human defensive lines and were advancing toward Earth itself. New Geneva was humanity's last major stronghold, a fortress city built into an asteroid that guarded the approaches to the human home system. The coalition had assembled the largest military force in galactic history, Zekathara said. 2 million soldiers, 1,000 warships, weapons capable of cracking planets. "We thought the war was finally ending. The siege had begun according to standard coalition doctrine. Overwhelming force, clear surrender demands, generous terms for those who yielded peacefully. Human military resistance was expected to collapse within days. Instead, we received a message from the human commander, a recording that was transmitted to every coalition ship in the fleet." The prosecutor activated an audio file. A human voice, calm and steady, filled the courtroom. "To the coalition forces approaching our position, we want you to know that we understand what you are trying to accomplish. We know you believe you are fighting for peace, order, and the good of the galaxy. We respect that. We also want you to know that we have been planning for this moment for 7 years, and what you are about to encounter will change you forever. We are sorry for what we must do to win." The recording ended. The courtroom was silent. "What did they mean?" the prosecutor asked. "We found out during the interrogation of captured human soldiers." Zekathara explained how coalition forces had successfully captured several hundred human prisoners during the early phases of the siege. Standard interrogation protocols were applied: psychological pressure, truth serums, mental scanning technology that could extract information directly from alien brains. "The prisoners broke quickly," she said. "Too quickly. They revealed detailed information about human defensive positions, weapon placements, supply routes, command structures. Our intelligence officers were pleased with how cooperative the humans were. But the information was false. Not all of it, just enough to matter. The humans had fed us a mixture of accurate details and critical lies that sent our forces into carefully prepared traps." The prosecutor looked confused. "Surely your interrogation specialist could detect deception." That was the horror of it. The humans were not lying. They genuinely believed the false information they were giving. Zekathara described how coalition intelligence had discovered that captured humans had been subjected to experimental psychological conditioning before the siege began. They had been trained to believe false memories so completely that even psychic interrogation confirmed their fabricated recollections. They had volunteered to have their own memories altered, she said slowly. Human soldiers had asked their own people to torture them psychologically, to plant false information in their minds, so that when they were captured and broken under interrogation, they would reveal lies that seemed like truth. The courtroom stirred uncomfortably. How many prisoners had undergone this process? We never found out, because we then discovered that some of the captured humans had been prisoners in coalition facilities for months or even years, allowing themselves to be experimented upon while gathering intelligence. Zekathara explained how coalition research stations throughout the galaxy had been accepting human volunteers for various scientific studies. The humans had claimed to be defectors, refugees, or simply curious about coalition technology. They endured medical experiments, psychological testing, biological research, anything that would allow them to study our capabilities from the inside. Some had been test subjects for so long that they had developed genuine friendships with coalition scientists. Were they spies? They were more than spies. They were living intelligence-gathering operations who had sacrificed their own well-being for strategic advantage. The prosecutor brought up medical records. Your report mentions that some of these human test subjects had been severely damaged by coalition research? Yes. Some had lost limbs, others had been infected with experimental diseases, some had suffered brain damage from psychological studies, but they had continued their missions anyway. Zekathara described discovering a human female who had been a test subject in coalition medical experiments for 3 years. She had lost both legs and one arm to surgical research, suffered organ damage from drug testing, and experienced memory loss from neurological studies. When we realized she was an intelligence agent, we expected her to be angry, resentful, seeking revenge for what had been done to her. Instead, she thanked us. "Thanked you?" She said the research had helped her understand coalition biology and medicine better than any human in history. She had learned how to treat coalition wounded more effectively than coalition doctors, and she had used that knowledge to save the lives of coalition soldiers who had been injured in battles against her own people. The prosecutor paused. She had been helping coalition forces while serving as a human intelligence agent. That was when we understood the true scope of human strategic thinking. They were not just fighting to win the war. They were fighting to understand us so completely that future conflicts would become impossible. Zekathara explained how coalition forces had begun, discovering human agents embedded throughout their military structure, not as saboteurs or assassins, but as helpers, medics, advisors, and friends who had been genuinely improving coalition capabilities while secretly studying coalition psychology. The humans we had captured, the humans we had tortured, the humans we had experimented on, they had all volunteered for these experiences. They had endured suffering deliberately to learn about us. What was their ultimate goal? To become us. To understand coalition species so thoroughly that they could predict our behavior, treat our diseases, speak our languages, appreciate our art, and connect with our emotions better than we could ourselves. The prosecutor showed intelligence reports. Coalition Command concluded what? That every major coalition victory had been allowed by humans as part of larger intelligence-gathering operations. We had been winning battles while losing the war, and we had never realized it. Zekathara described how coalition leaders had gradually understood that human resistance was not desperate defense, but controlled education. Humans had been using the war itself as a massive research project to study coalition civilization. They could have defeated us much earlier, she said, but they chose to prolong the conflict so they could learn everything about us. Our technology, our psychology, our culture, our hopes, our fears, everything. Why? So that when the war ended, they would be able to serve as bridges between human and coalition civilizations. They were not just fighting for victory. They were fighting for understanding, Zeki. Thara looked around the courtroom. The siege of New Geneva ended when Coalition Command realized that continuing the war would only give humans more opportunities to study us. We were not facing an enemy anymore. We were facing students who had become teachers, and they knew us better than we knew ourselves. The prosecutor asked the final question. What did this teach you about human nature? That humans do not fight wars to destroy their enemies. They fight wars to transform their enemies into allies, and they are willing to sacrifice everything, even their own humanity, to achieve that transformation. The prosecutor returned to his desk and picked up a single document. The courtroom was completely silent as he walked back to Zekathara. We have heard your testimony about human battlefield tactics, their intelligence operations, their willingness to sacrifice themselves for strategic advantage. But the war ended 50 years ago. Why are you here today? Zekathara looked around the courtroom one final time. Her eyes settled on the human prosecutor, then moved to the mixed jury of alien species, many of whom had fought in the war she had described. Because the real war never ended, it transformed into something else entirely. She explained how the peace treaty had been negotiated, not in the aftermath of military defeat, but in recognition of a fundamental shift in galactic politics. Coalition leaders had realized they were not fighting a war against humanity, but participating in humanity's education about galactic civilization. The human negotiator was the same female who had been a test subject in coalition medical experiments, Zekathara said. She walked into the peace conference missing 2 limbs and carrying detailed medical files about every coalition species represented in the room. The peace talks had lasted 6 months, but not because of disagreement about terms. They had lasted because the human delegation had used the negotiations to demonstrate the depth of their understanding about coalition psychology, technology, and culture. Every day the humans would present new evidence of how thoroughly they had studied us, maps of coalition territory that were more accurate than our own, psychological profiles of coalition leaders that predicted their negotiating strategies, technical specifications for coalition equipment that included improvements our own engineers had not considered. The prosecutor asked, "What were the terms of the peace treaty?" That was the most disturbing part. The humans did not demand territory, resources, or reparations. They asked for only one thing: permission to help. Zekathara described how humanity had offered to share everything they had learned during the war. Medical techniques that could cure coalition diseases, psychological therapies that could help coalition veterans, technological improvements that could enhance coalition equipment, cultural insights that could resolve conflicts between coalition species. They wanted to become teachers, advisors, healers, and mediators for the entire galaxy. And the coalition agreed. The coalition had no choice. The humans had demonstrated that they understood us better than we understood ourselves. Refusing their help would have meant continuing to struggle with problems they had already solved. Zekathara explained how the post-war period had seen unprecedented cooperation between human and coalition civilizations, human doctors working in coalition hospitals, human engineers improving coalition technology, human psychologists helping coalition species understand each other better. But it was not conquest through force. It was conquest through competence. The prosecutor brought up records from the 50 years since the war ended. Human influence in galactic affairs has expanded significantly. Some species have accused humanity of cultural imperialism, of using their knowledge to manipulate other civilizations. What is your opinion? That is why I am here, Zekathara said quietly. She explained how she had become part of human intelligence operations during the war itself. Not through coercion or bribery, but through a single incident that had changed her understanding of human nature entirely. My squad was ambushed during a reconnaissance mission on Kepler 186F. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by human forces. 3 of my soldiers were wounded, including my clutch sister, Velthara. Zekathara described how human soldiers had emerged from concealment and offered medical assistance to the wounded coalition troops. No demands for surrender, no interrogation, no attempt to capture prisoners. They treated our wounds more effectively than our own medics could have. They shared their food and water with us. They provided shelter while we waited for coalition rescue forces to arrive. Why? I asked the human medic that same question. She said they had studied Corellian biology extensively and knew that Velthara would die without immediate treatment that only humans could provide. She said they could not stand by and watch someone die when they had the knowledge to save her. The human medic had explained that humanity's goal was not to defeat the coalition through warfare, but to prove that cooperation was more beneficial than conflict for everyone involved. They saved my clutch sister's life, and then helped us return safely to coalition lines. No conditions, no expectations, no requests for anything in return. Zekathara explained how this experience had led her to volunteer as a liaison between human and coalition forces. She had spent the remaining years of the war helping both sides understand each other better. I learned that humans had never intended to win through military superiority. They had intended to win by becoming indispensable to galactic civilization. The prosecutor asked, "Do you believe humanity represents a threat to galactic independence?" "I believe humanity represents evolution." Zekathara stood up, her 4 arms gesturing to encompass the entire courtroom. Look around this room. Coalition species who fought bitter wars against each other for thousands of years now serve together on the same jury. Conflicts that seemed irreconcilable have been resolved through human mediation. Diseases that plagued entire civilizations have been cured through human medicine. She explained how human influence had not replaced coalition culture, but enhanced it. Corellian crystal music had been improved through human acoustic analysis. Vesperian agriculture had become more efficient through human biological research. Thalnari mathematics had advanced through human pattern recognition techniques. Humans did not conquer us. They upgraded us. The prosecutor asked the final question. What should the galaxy understand about human nature? Zekathara looked directly at the human prosecutor. That humans do not seek to rule other species. They seek to serve them. But their service comes with a price. You must accept that they will understand you better than you understand yourself. And they will use that understanding to help you become better than you thought possible. She paused. The grim secret of human battlefields is not that humans are willing to become monsters to win. The grim secret is that humans are willing to become whatever you need them to become to help you grow. And once you accept their help, you discover that you cannot live without it. Zekathara sat down. 50 years ago, I was a coalition warrior fighting against human invaders. Today, I am a galactic citizen whose life has been immeasurably improved by human knowledge, human medicine, human psychology, and human friendship. The war is over, but the human victory continues every day. The prosecutor nodded. No further questions. As Zekthara left the witness stand, the courtroom remained silent. The trial would continue for several more days, but everyone present understood that they had heard the most important testimony they would ever encounter. The humans had not won through superior weapons or overwhelming force. They had won by proving that understanding your enemy completely allows you to love them, and that loving your enemy completely transforms them into family. The galactic community would spend the next century debating whether this represented the highest evolution of civilization or the most sophisticated form of conquest ever devised, but they would debate it in peace, prosperity, and mutual understanding that would have been impossible without human intervention. And in the end, that was perhaps the most human victory of all, winning a war so completely that no one could remember why the fighting had started, or imagine how life could be better without the people who had once been enemies.